can share.
Okay.
Okay, just give a second. Because technology is complicated. We had some issues in the previous session with the cameras not working.
Okay.
So I think this is a link. I'm going to send the link here in the chat, and I'm also going to send it personally to you. Thank you. Hobson, you can go.
Okay. So are we live now?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on our time zone. Welcome to our roundtable 3 from the event entitled Medievalism and Teaching. So we have 3 panelists on this table. First of all, I'd like to welcome Professor Claudia Bovo from Federal University of Triângulo Mineiro. I don't think I can translate that in any sense, but well, Professor Claudia Bovo has been teaching and studying medieval history for a long time, from how can we say, Romance de Cavalaria,
chivalry romances.
Chivalry romances. Yeah, she's been studying Peter Damian and monasticism in the High Middle Ages, and now from on the recent years, she's been studying the relationship between East and West in the Mediterranean in the 11th century, and she's studying Greek also, which I mean, for me, it's a pleasure because I can talk to her. I have someone to talk to in Greek in the group, but she will talk to us in English, so don't worry. Claudia, you have your time. You have 15 minutes. I don't know, Luis. How much time?
Each panelist has 15 minutes to do like a brief expo. Then you open to debate amongst yourselves. You can do some questions, okay. And then you open to public debate.
Okay, 20 minutes, Mike. Okay.
15. Okay, thank you so much, Hobson, for a kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm grateful to all people in Medieval Studies group of Unimontes for this great opportunity to hear from and to discuss with such a highly specialized audience. The main core of my investigation is not about medievalism. I'm a traditional professor of medieval studies, but as university history professor at Public University in Brazil, my focus is to train new teachers, help them to be good teachers at elementary school and high school. I'm sharing my Today, my presentation is about some reflections on the medievalism contributions and its impact on historical education in Brazil. In our approach of the Middle Ages, we reproduce countless interpretations of this period without realizing that they are historiographic constructions and contemporary appropriations that help define the place and relevance of such study in the present. Not only are history scholars, but also lay people able to talk about the Middle Ages. From fantasy reference, which involve the supernatural and its manifestations, such as dragon and magic potions, to the most precise statistics about ailments that decimate thousands of lives, the content of the so-called medieval history has become widely known. Such reports can be negative reference at time, virtuous or exotic reference at the older times, crystallize the historical experience for posterity. This is evident in day-by-day use of the term medieval that can to refer to negative or out-of-date elements, but also use it to refer to fascinating elements of our lives. To many medievalists, such popularity of Middle Age topics in general culture might seem harmful to history learning. However, there is no denying that it is this popularity that gives life to medieval studies. How can we ignore that people's interests justify the founding of our studies? If the goal of the history is to make sense of human experience in time, how can medievalists ignore the current public interest in them studies? Going future, how can medievalists avoid debating the Middle Ages appropriation? Influenced by the works of the Hayden White in the meta-history and the practical past, as well as by John Huston in history, narration, interpretation, orientation, and our Brazilian guy, Paulo Freire, in pedagogy of freedom, I understand that Middle Ages, as a historical period and as a slice of time that categorizes a group of societies that shared organization principles and similar foundings, can be seen as a medievalism on itself. In other words, the concept of the Middle Ages on itself, as well as its multiple meanings, can be considered a medievalism, an allogenous conceptual construction whose origin is distance from the societies and cultures that inspired its historical temporality. In this multiple interpretation package, we apply the same condition to both perspectives, be them professional historic or popular interpretations. Both are crafting medievalism. I mean, both interpretations appropriate the Middle Ages, despite giving them different outcomes to use of the such temporal historical interpretation. By theoretically recognizing that Middle Ages do not currently exist as historical experience per se, but as a rich category incarnated by the posthuman human interpretation, I raise the question, what is the role of the Middle Ages in the historic education guidelines of young people today? That is the issue that moves towards the debate about the medievalism and historical education. In a society where there are multiple ways to gather information, the authority of the scientific historical discourse is not a given. In a situation like from Brazil, where schools having been losing relevance to the multiple forms of gathering information, where historians are rejected as the main agents of the social memory management, and where the scientific historical writings are questioned by other means of reference to the past, it is most important to intensify history teaching in the deployment of the naturalization of history and their constant social, political, and cultural uses. To determine the magnitude of medievalism, circulation is a necessary task for the historical education, a setting where traditional many historical experiences, memories, and narratives coexist at times in opposition to each other. In addition, most of these narratives are distant from standardized constructions within the boundaries of the so-called scientific history. Nowadays, school settings may be the only places where there is a direct contact between the scientific history and the so-called the practical past. By scientific history, I mean the multiple historical, academic, and school knowledge produced under theoretical and methodological criteria from the subject organization. By the practical past, I mean the set of historical experience expressions that may or may not be organized in an explanatory narrative of the historical process. What John Huston's history theory advocates is that historical learning is primarily concerned to minimize the imposition pressure of thinking, wishing, expecting, and fearing on students. They use their own time experience as reference, but that's how it is. One more reference among some men that, when put together, allow students to cognitively balance lived history and explanatory narrative history. These ways of interpreting our social experience limited by time are common to all of us. Be it yesterday's memory, be it the expectation for tomorrow. We all have historical perception. Or in words of John Huston, we all have historical consciousness. Oh, sorry. It's so difficult for me. But some of us, by scientific knowledge, develop interpretative actions and time orientations based not only on our experience, but also on the interpretative potential that comes from the naturalization, especially from school and professional education. The commitment of school historical education should be to present aspects to these countless historical perceptions in use, and through the practice of contextualization and problematization of what we live, reconstruct the historical thinking process. The process of historical education of what is known as early temporality, as the Middle Ages, have distinct impact in diverse knowledge mobilization to time, orientation, and to contemporary historic consciousness. This owing to the fact that Brazil does not have a medieval origin supported by professional historiography, but by mobilization of public history that is known in the country, especially under the strong new Pentecostal manifestation. It is necessary to recognize these ordinary narratives space as legitimate place to carry out historiographical operation. There is substantial demand for information about Middle Ages in Brazil. However, such demand is usually associated with the need to seek confirmation of a wishful Middle Ages, lived as part of fantasy, of evasion by the wonders of curious, real, imagined past in which one can identify solid content of rejection to the period. At times, the Dark Ages and the Golden Age are blended so as to provide realism to the fantasy that, supported by stereotypes, are not the least worried about facts. To the people who get to school or university, motivated by the will to know the Middle Ages, there is not much magic to be offered. There is the satisfaction of a well-formulated question and the discovery from the explorations of documents and historiography. Regarding the Middle Ages, it is always necessary to ask, what in the present escaped from us that puts the past at risk? Whoever is willing to know constructions and denaturalize the Middle Ages must be awakened by the teasing of strangeness identified in the extreme difference between our current way of life and that of early times. It is this extreme alterity that must be emphasized as congenital wonder to them. The issue of medieval alterity.
Claude, sorry, 5 minutes.
Okay. The issue of medieval alterity sheds light in the other ways rural societies, religion experience, relations with wealth and violence can be, besides this experience with the different rhythms of change. By observing a life that no longer exists, students can be motivated to improve the competence of interpreting the humanity and themselves. They can overcome demands from the primary subjectivity present in their way of seeing, feeling, thinking what they like, what makes them apt to supplant themselves at the only instance of legitimation of the practice of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Awesome presentation as always. I have some questions for you later, but for now I'll proceed to give the word to Brian Egede Patterson. Sorry if I pronounced your name badly.
As long as you don't call me the Edge, it's fine.
Edged?
Edge. Don't call me Edge. Anything else, I love it.
Okay. So he teaches in Nykøbing Cathedral School. Is that right?
Absolutely fine.
Okay. In Denmark. So he has a master's degree in history as his major and a minor degree in English from the University of Southern Denmark. Since graduating in 2009, he has spent most of his time teaching Denmark's upper secondary school sector, winning the Teachers of the Year award in 2017. In addition, Brian has been an assistant professor at the University of Southern Denmark, teaching the course of the Appropriation and Communication of History several times, written textbooks, and worked as a consulting editor for the Danish Ministry of Education. Did I get everything right?
Yes, that seems to be just about anything.
So thank you very much for your presentation. You have 20 minutes. I'll give you some more time. So okay, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that, Robson. Hopefully I won't spend that much time. I'm just going to say as little as possible for us to have as much discussion as possible afterwards. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you, but most of what I'm going to tell you is simply just an introduction to the Danish education system, because you probably don't know it, but it's really, really relevant for everything that I'm going to tell you later on. So here we go. So first of all, the timing of this could not have been better, because over the past week, a Danish film called Another Round won an Oscar for Best International Feature Film. And that film is about 4 high school teachers who decide to consume alcohol every day to see where that leads them. But that's not what we're going to talk about right now. I'm simply going to talk about why memes and medievalism make a lot of sense in the Danish upper secondary school system where I teach. So just to give you the Danish education system at a glance, it's practically compulsory for everybody to attend what we call the 0th to the 9th grade with an optional 10th grade, but that is not my department. I teach in the upper secondary school sector, meaning the age groups of 16 to 19, approximately, give or take a little bit. And we have a 2-year program and a 3-year program, and both of these are supposed to lead to higher education afterwards. So this is where I am, this is what I teach. Now, the goals that all subjects must contribute to in our system are personal autonomy and critical thinking. In many ways, the Danish education system is built on the German Bildung tradition, where we are supposed to build complete human beings, but it's a modernized version. Over the course of the 2 or 3 year program, all students must acquire global competences, career competences, innovative competences, and digital competences. And of course, a part of digital competences is to navigate, or being able to navigate online content, including, for instance, memes, propaganda, and so on they might find out there. The exams the students have to take are a mix of written and oral exams. We have far more oral exams than most other education systems, as far as I'm aware of. And a common element in all of these exams is that the students face material that they have never seen before. We do not have any multiple choice exams or anything along those lines. All exam material is something the student has never seen before. It is connected to a theme they have studied in class, but they must apply the skills they have acquired in class, not just knowledge they have from there. So if we move to history in particular, when the students take the oral exam in history, and it's only an oral exam, their assessment is based solely on how they're able to apply critical analysis and spot nuances in a discussion afterwards. If they show up only knowing historical facts, historical background knowledge, that is usually not enough to pass. They must be able to use historical methods in all of this. Now, this is a bit of a tall task, and I'll just show you the difference between our 2 programs and what is required here. For the 3-year program, what we call History A-level, it is a 30-minute oral exam with assessment and discussion amongst a teacher and an external assessor along the way. The student receives 90 minutes of preparation to study and analyze 3 to 5 pages of material. This must be a mix of different elements. So usually always text and pictures, but it could also include statistics, video clips, practically everything. And the student must also be able to create questions on different levels. So not just when were the Crusades, but as you will see later on, do we today see the Crusades as something to admire or something to feel, to detest, or something along those lines, and just base it on the material they receive. The 2-year program is what we call B level. They've had fewer lessons, so the requirements are slightly less advanced. It's also a 30-minute oral exam with 60 minutes of preparation, only 1.5 to 2 pages of material. Questions on different levels are provided, and I have an example for you in just a moment for you to see what it looks like. Now, once again, this is a bit of a tall task, a bit of a mouthful for a lot of students, because there's a lot of things you have to be able to show that you know how to do in relatively limited amount of time, and you must be able to study and analyze something you've never seen before. And this may be quite difficult for some of them. So we decided, some of us teachers, see how could we make this more efficient? How could we help these students? And that's when we came up with what we call the 5 bricks model, because after all, we are the birthplace of Lego. So all students grew up playing with bricks, and this is what we decided to do. So students can receive pretty much anything. We teachers create our own exam material, meaning that there could be anything from eyewitness accounts, the interpretation of historians, movie posters, propaganda images, and I even once included a selfie made by Kim Kardashian in a set of exam material about the Renaissance. So this is what we tell the students. Do this. Whatever you receive, whatever kind of source you receive, just look at this. Go for the theme, the genre. Who is the sender? Is the sender biased? What is the context? What is the relationship between the sender and the receiver? What is the purpose or the message of the source? And this must mirror the theme. Now, for students who are either disadvantaged or who come from non-academic homes, this is also fairly difficult for them to get to grips with everything, which is why we invented, a fellow teacher and I, what you can see called the golden lines in here. Simply, if you don't know where to start, here's a sentence to get you going with everything. Most students take these golden lines and eventually move on to inventing their own vocabulary. But some students who have problems getting started, this has really helped them to get to grips with critical analysis. No matter if it is the A level or the B level, according to the law we have about education, we must cover what we call the use of history or the appropriation of history. This is a given. This must be included no matter what. And quite a few models for a critical approach, you can find out that are just preoccupied with how do you assess or address the credibility of primary sources. And of course, that's not really useful when you talk about appropriation of history. And this is a place where we've had a lot of success using memes and other examples of a modern appropriation of the Middle Ages to show the students how it's done. So first of all, this is very, very simple model we've set up for how to study the appropriation of history. Step one, this axis. Do we use history as a role model? Or does the source, in this case, use history as a role model or as a cautionary tale? And no matter what, move on and ask the big question, why is the past used as either a role model or a cautionary tale? Does it have something to do with the context or the sender's bias? What's going on here? And this is something that has really helped the students, especially when we talk about the Middle Ages and modern appropriation of the Middle Ages. Now, an example of exam material, just so you can see what we expect from a B-level student. For instance, this is what they received. First of all, the questions made by me. What were the Crusades? Just very brief overview, should only take about a minute or something of presentation. Step two, analyze the depiction of cultural encounters during the Crusades. Use material one and knowledge from our lessons. Material one is an excerpt from 1001 Tales, a story about the Patriarch of Constantinople. Finally, discuss to what extent the Crusades are used as a role model or as a cautionary tale in the present use materials 2+3. Once again, using the same terms that the students are used to from everyday classes. And material two, is this a propaganda image like this? And material three, is this meme, this depiction of Donald Trump as a Templar, with a note stating that this is from a very patriotic website, so they don't think it is ironic. And then, of course, why is the past portrayed in this manner? Now, the next question is, what do the students say? And I've had a really wonderful chat with a handful of my students, and here's the picture I took of them earlier today. And I'm not going to talk about what they said just yet. I'll save that for the discussion afterwards so we can have as much discussion as possible. But what I did with this class was that when we covered our Crusades theme, we incorporated a lot of Deus Vult memes, and many students had encountered Deus Vult memes already. The students studied excerpts of manifestos by Breivik and by the Christchurch mosque shooter. If you heard my talk yesterday, you already know something about that. And in a beautiful example, you can see Hekla at the top right told me that she had actually discussed parts of this with her mother when she came home, and the mother had said, I'm not quite sure how I feel about you studying extremism. And Hekla had simply replied, it's really important that we do this. We need to understand this. So this was a great success for the students right here. And I'll come back later on to what Mads, Hekla, Anine, and Sarah said about studying memes and understanding appropriation of history that way. And that leads me on to the questions that I'd like to discuss with all of you. What I've shown you here, this approach to teaching medievalism in this way, is this an approach that could be useful for you in the different systems that you're in out there? And if you have any reactions to this approach to teaching, well, what are they? And honestly, I can't wait to get into a discussion about all of this in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Now we move on to Professor Michael Evans from Delta College in the United States. Professor Michael Evans is a specialist in medieval Europe, especially the Crusades. He has some works on medievalism and well, you can proceed with your communication. Thank you for presence.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Always nervous this will never work when I first do it. Okay. Okay, does that look right to everybody? I'll take the silence as being yes. Okay, so I teach at a community college in the United States. I should probably start by explaining what community colleges are. They're equivalent approximately to the first 2 years of university. Traditionally, they are seen as trade schools, teaching things like nursing or air conditioner repair and so on. But they're also often used as jumping off points to four-year institutions for various reasons, perhaps because they are cheaper or because the class sizes are smaller or because students haven't done well at school. Community colleges are more open, more accessible than four-year universities. And because of this, the type of history I teach, because we're teaching introductory level, is often very broad and frankly very superficial. One example of this is that I teach Western civilization. This is fairly typical to an American college or university, that one of the broad introductory classes is Western civilization, usually abbreviated to Western Civ by the students. And as you can see from this typical textbook table of contents, this is very broad. This is from a textbook covering the first half of Western civilization. It's usually taught in 2 parts, 1 semester each. And as you see, we get from the ancient and Near East to the scientific revolution in 15 or 16 weeks. And it's very much broken down chronologically, a time period each week. And it's also kind of Eurocentric. Europe, of course, moves. Europe and the West begins in the Middle East and migrates westward to Greece and then to Rome and then to Western Europe. Funny thing, Western civilization, it moves around depending on what time period you're looking at. So we tend to lose a breadth of chronology, and we lose a breadth of global context. We're focused on the West and we tend to do 1 time period per week. It can be problematic trying to establish links across regions and links across different time periods. And this is where I'm trying to bring in medievalism. I realized when I was rehearsing this talk, I don't really talk much about medievalism, actually. I talk more about teaching the Middle Ages. I suppose my medievalism angle is attempting to make links between the Middle Ages and post-medieval history in order to get students to understand the context and the relevance of the Middle Ages. I've also taught at other institutions world history, which is similar in the sense of it's rather introductory and rather superficial, but is less focused on Europe. And I'm going to talk about some of the problems briefly of teaching medieval world history, because we also, because of the sheer superficiality of having to get through so much material in so short a time, tend to be very superficial in the approach, particularly to non-European cultures. Okay, this is an example I often like to use with students when we hit the Middle Ages in the Western civilization class. This is the Ashante ewer. I first encountered this object in an exhibition about the court of Richard II at the National Gallery in London. Richard II was King of England in the late 14th century. Here we see the Ashante ewer compared to 2 similar objects from the same location and time period from late 14th century England. It's called the Ashante ewer because it was located at the court of the Ashante king in what is now Ghana. And when I saw this object in an exhibition, there was an interpretative and interpretation label which said something along the lines of, I paraphrase, this was found in the Ashante court in 1895. We have no idea how it got there, or words to that effect. Well, firstly, it wasn't found, it was stolen. 1895 was a year when Britain conquered the Ashante, and it was stolen from the court of the Ashante king, not found or discovered. But secondly, there's no great mystery to how an object from medieval England could travel to Ghana. So I pose this mystery, quotes unquotes, to my students, and they often very quickly think, well, maybe trade, and they're correct. Trade routes lead to the transportation of these high status objects. When I show them this map of trade routes in medieval Europe, they think, well, maybe it could get close to Africa by being traded down to the Iberian Peninsula. But this trade map makes Europe appear separate from the rest of the world. Other than these trade routes to the Middle East and to the Black Sea region, Europe appears cut off from a broader global context. If I show them this map, they see that there's also trade routes across the Sahara Desert. They can very easily hypothesize that this object finds its way to Iberia, then to North Africa, then to West Africa using the trans-Saharan trade routes. And these trade route maps give us a different perspective on medieval history beyond the European. In a different class I taught about the Renaissance and the Reformation, I had my students give a final project which I called Making Connections. I left it fairly broad as to what connections they were going to make. One connection was to connect Renaissance Europe to the wider world. And one of my students gave a presentation about the Crusades and trade routes to the Middle East, etc., as examples of how culture comes in from the Arab world and Asia into Renaissance Europe. And he used a map similar to one of these. It was actually this map on the right, or one similar to that he used. He mistakenly pulled a map down from the internet of trade routes linking Europe with Asia, across the Asian continent and through the Indian Ocean trade routes. And this mistake was understandable. These trade routes are very similar to those of medieval Afro-Eurasia shown in this map. And this map shows the Belt and Road Initiative of modern China. So he inadvertently made a very interesting connection between the Middle Ages and the modern world, and a very interesting non-Eurocentric connection. Europe and the West are not the only cultures that use medievalism. China is using medievalism to emphasize this new Silk Road, as it's described in this American map. The Silk Road is being recreated as the road across Central Asia, and the Indian Ocean Trade Network is being recreated as the belt aspect of the Belt and Road. Interestingly, when the Suez Canal was blocked off recently, some people created memes contrasting modernity with tradition, and claiming that tradition was the route around Africa that was being recreated by the blockage of the Suez Canal. I pointed out it's actually the opposite. The route around Africa is a product of Portuguese colonialism. The traditional route actually does pass through the Middle East. There was no canal, but the route through Suez is far more medieval than the route around Africa. Okay, so we can use these connections in Afro-Eurasia to decenter Europe in medieval history. As I mentioned earlier, I've also taught world history, and here we encounter some problems. The superficial nature of the teaching of world history means that there's an aspect of it's week 2, so it's China, it's week 3, so it's India. We give these very superficial overviews of non-European culture. And some figures always stand in for interregional connections. The stand-in for the sub-Sahara trade route is this character, Mansa Musa, a king of Mali in the 14th century. And every world history textbook I've come across always has a little feature about Mansa Musa. He went on pilgrimage to Mecca. He was so fabulously wealthy. He ruined the Egyptian economy by spending so much money in Cairo en route to Mecca. And I understand why he's an attractive figure. He symbolizes these interregional connections. He challenges the Western stereotype of African poverty. He challenges the Western stereotype of African backwardness and isolation. He challenges the more general stereotype of the Middle Ages as an era of isolation and no long-range connections. A second figure who stands in is Zheng He. I seem to have missed off his name from here. Again, like Mansa Musa, Zheng He is featured in every every world history textbook. He was a Chinese admiral, interestingly a Muslim, so he gives us intercultural connections there, who led a series of voyages as far west as East Africa and the Middle East. And he again is an attractive figure to put into textbooks because he challenges the Eurocentric view that only the Spanish and Portuguese were taking part in long distance voyages in the Middle Ages. He gives us this interregional connectivity. But unfortunately, I think a sense of a medievalism is being brought in by using these two figures, by standing in for whole cultures. It can fail to challenge the superficiality of Western teaching of non-Western cultures. And there are, in some ways, I think, rather medievalist viewpoints being put across. Fabulous wealth of Mansa Musa, for example, just focusing on the gold and the wealth of his kingdom, I think has the danger that students don't actually consider the broader culture beyond thinking, hey, he was really wealthy. Likewise, Zheng He stands out as this kind of exception. Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? That the Chinese were taking part in long distance voyages and can perhaps obscure a deeper understanding of Chinese culture, and can obscure an understanding of the Indian Ocean trade network, which was not a one-off associated with the voyages of Zheng He, but which was a long-standing network and actually not dominated by China, but dominated by Muslim middlemen in South and West Asia and East Africa. Okay, now the good thing about this kind of focus on non-European Middle Ages is that it can dethrone traditional Western figures who stand in for Western domination over the globe, but also who stand in for the idea of medievalism versus modernity. Columbus and Vasco de Gama are traditionally presented not simply as figures of European exploration and conquest, but as figures of the modern modernity, the modern world triumphing over the backwardness and ignorance and parochialism of the Middle Ages. And I like to, an example of the kind of way in which Vasco da Gama becomes this hero for identity and modernity is this logo. It's a little covered up in my screen, so I nearly missed it, which you may recognize as being a Portuguese football team, Vasco da Gama, named by Portuguese immigrants after a Portuguese national hero to emphasize that sense of tradition and national identity of Portuguese in the New World. And also, of course, Vasco da Gama's voyages are part of the process that leads to the Portuguese discovery, in quotes again, and colonization of Brazil. There you go. I've managed to bring in a Brazilian connection to my talk. Now, I always like to tell a story. I began with an anecdote of the Ashante Ewe. I'm going to end with an anecdote, which I like to use to undermine the Eurocentric and undermine the narrative of modernity versus medievalism, which is to emphasize that Vasco da Gama discovered nothing. He did not find a new land. He reached India, which had been known to Westerners since classical times. He did not establish regular trade between the West and India for the first time. That had long been established by Muslim merchants. And there's a wonderful story which illustrates the fact he was merely finding a new and rather long-winded way to find a country that had already been contacted. The story goes is that Vasco da Gama sends somebody ashore in India to check out the scene and is greeted by a Tunisian merchant was able to speak Spanish and Portuguese thanks to the proximity of North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, and says to him, "May the devil take you what brought you here." Now, I'm not sure I have a neat conclusion to this, but these are just some thoughts I wanted to bring about how the teaching of the Middle Ages in the context of non-medieval focused classes, in the context of long time period introductory classes, can help to undermine Eurocentrism, undermine colonialist approaches, and break down differences in periodization, challenging the medieval versus modern dichotomy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Evans. I'd like to thank all the panelists for the great presentations that you showed us. And before going for the questions from the audience, I'd like to make one myself. For all of you three, it's a bit of a provocation, but I mean, all the three presentations dealt with the same problem. I mean, as I see it, because all of you, when you teach medieval history, when you teach Middle Ages, you have to give some kind of satisfaction to the students about what Middle Ages means. And by what the Middle Ages mean is more like the stereotypical figure of the Middle Ages. It's not like a concrete Middle Ages, because I mean, for myself, I don't believe in a concrete Middle Ages. I don't think that anything is medieval by itself. And when all of you give concrete examples of objects that you're dealing with in your classes, I particularly liked Professor Evans showing things like in Africa, in Asia, and all this part of the great navigations in the 15th, 16th century. I mean, for us in Brazil, because of our national history, we kind of tend to think of it like modern history, not much as medieval history, but I know the frontiers are a bit of fluid. But I mean, when you teach something like a concrete object, you don't need to use the concept Middle Ages. I mean, this is kind of paradoxical, because when we teach Middle Ages, we kind of like, for some moments, we disappear with the concept. And I mean, Claudia was very right when she pointed from Husserl that the teaching Middle Ages and the concept Middle Ages itself is a kind of medievalism. It's a kind of more than an image that pleases us in the present that makes any sense in the past. So, I mean, how you three deal with this? Because when we have to say something about Middle Ages to our students, we are kind of reiterating the concept that, at least for me, has a lot of problems. And when we actually teach a point like, okay, I'm gonna teach the 11th century, I'm gonna teach the Crusades, I don't need a concept. How do you deal with this? I'd like to hear all of you three, if I may. So we may begin with Claudia.
Well, I start talking about the Middle Ages does exist. Middle Ages is a concept, is a heuristic concept, is the medieval history exists. The medieval history exists, but the Middle Ages and the antiquity, modernity is a construction of heuristic concept.
Ryan?
Yes, I think this, I really like that you touched upon the national differences in there, because it usually blows my students' minds when I show them that we can't even agree on when the Middle Ages were, if they even existed. Because, for instance, in Scandinavia, we have the Viking Age as a separate element from 793 until about 1066 or something along those lines, which we say is a very particular period, which it really wasn't. Just Scandinavians pretty much behaving like everybody else. They just weren't Christians. And also when the Middle Ages end, and what is even more fascinating from a Danish perspective, because just like we heard with Alaska earlier today, Denmark also has a really strong Protestant Lutheran tradition. So usually the Middle Ages have sort of a bit of a bad reputation. If I only looked at what I was taught about the Middle Ages in primary school, it was just, poor peasants wallowing in mud until they died of the plague, while priests lied to them in Latin or forced them to pay money to get into heaven. And I think it was only about at university level I finally understood that indulgence could also be something you achieved for going on a crusade or a pilgrimage or something, not just something you paid for. So I think what I usually do is to tell them that the Middle Ages are not that special in that way. First of all, that there are so many different interpretations of when the Middle Ages were or what they were all about, and how, for instance, some ideas such as the three estates, well, that's something that a lot of European society is built on up until the French Revolution. And the nobility in Denmark have privileges because they're supposed to fight until 1658, 59, 1660, when they run away from Sweden because they don't want to fight them, and then they're removed. All their privileges are taken away. So I think partially because there's so much the Renaissance, brilliant era, Roman Empire, brilliant era, Middle Ages, terrible. And I think just the element of tearing that down a bit and saying, well, there are so many more nuances to it than what you've been shown so far, dear students. I think that is the first step to tell them that, well, like everything else in life and history, things are more complicated.
Thank you. Professor Michael?
Yes, I agree, absolutely. I love to challenge and to break down these concepts in my teaching. My favorite is to mess with the concept of the Renaissance. When we get to the Renaissance, or when I taught the Renaissance and Reformation class, I always draw a diagram in which I say, traditionally, the Middle Ages go up to about 1500, 1485 if you're in the UK, 1494 if you're in France, whatever, about 1500. And then this is when the Renaissance took place, and I draw a line from about roughly 1400 to about 1600, say. And I say, what's this little bit that overlaps? Well, hang on, the Renaissance and the Middle Ages overlap. And then we get to talking about how the Renaissance is a concept, a movement, not necessarily a time period. And there's a wonderful video I like to play them from the Crash Course series, which is on YouTube, about the Renaissance, which is called something like The Renaissance, Was It a Thing? In which it presents this whole idea of, can we even talk about the Renaissance? Did the Renaissance even happen? And John Green, the presenter of that video, says, it's not like the moon landings where somebody wakes you up and say, hey, get out of bed, the Renaissance is happening, you have to see it. And I also like to say that this overlap, the 15th century, is it Renaissance or is it medieval? If it's plague and war, religious persecution, it's medieval. If it's paintings, if it's culture, it's the Renaissance. And obviously as a joke, but that gets across this idea that we're very selective in what we call things. And the other example I like to play as a video is, there's a 1950s British movie called The Third Man. And there's a scene where one of the characters, to justify his own cynical behavior, says to the other, Renaissance Italy, murder, war, religious intolerance gave us Michelangelo and Leonardo. Switzerland, 500 years of peace and democracy gives us the cuckoo clock.
Thank you. Any questions everyone, feel free to make it. If you need any help with the English, I can translate it or something like that. Carolina?
Just remembering, we can promote people so they can talk. I think you can do it, Robson, but if you can't, let me know.
Promote, like...
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, hi.
Yes, yes. The promote basically means unmuting my microphone so I can speak.
You're a panelist now.
Yes, that's it. Well, thank you. Thank you, all three of you. Lots of things to consider. I have a curious question to Brian, because I'm kind of blown away by the Danish educational system. And I guess most of my Brazilian colleagues are probably as well. Could you talk a little bit about what kind of base these, because your example of your teaching and of these exams and this kind of work, these oral exams, it's for a higher level, right? You said 12 to 16-year-olds, if I'm not mistaken. This idea that they are examined on topic in something that they haven't actually seen. They have to apply the methods, right?
Yes, sorry, they're a bit older than that. They usually start at the upper secondary level the year they turn 16.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Some of them a year before that, some of them a year after that. We're trying not to stress the students too much right here.
Yeah.
And then
So
usually
it's just to understand what kind of background do they have before that in order to be able to deal with this kind of study and this kind of exams.
Yes, they also have to take oral exams in what we call primary school, but primary school usually ends the year the students turn 16. So that's after what we call 9th grade. I think I would love if they had more of a background, because a very specific example from primary school history teaching some years ago was that they made a law stating that now they were going to strengthen history teaching. And what they did was that they required that at least 60% of all history lessons had to be with a teacher who was educated in history. So pretty bad, actually, that a lot of classes were covered by teachers who weren't trained history teachers, who were trained in some other subject and then had to do this, because they actually also have to cover appropriation of history, I think from the 8th grade or something, which is really, really tough. But they have a tiny bit of training in it before they come to my level. But usually, yeah, we have to run pretty quickly and to achieve the level that is required right here. It is a system that seriously rewards the students who are able to understand methods and theory and think outside the box when they're about 18 or 19. But the students who are mostly able to reproduce what they have read are seriously left behind in this. So there's a lot of sort of either or in this, but we try to lift all the students so they at least know how to look for the bias of the sender and the context of all the sources.
Can I just follow up on that and then ask how you said that there are students that struggle? In your experience, is that a large part or a smaller part? Like
really depends on which part of the country you're in. I teach in sort of a rural area. I think we are in the 3rd lowest income group, which is still pretty solid. But we can really see that grade point average has a strong connection to, obviously, no surprise to anybody, the parents' education level. We still struggle with that to a large degree. How many students struggle? I think in the average class, it will probably be 10 to 15%, something along those lines.
All right, thank you so much.
So, questions? Thanks, Carol. Claudio?
Thank you, Robson. To Brian, too. I think I may have missed something at the beginning of your presentation, Brian, but how much time in history curriculum is set aside to teach topics relative to Middle Ages? Because in Brazil, the themes of medieval history only appear in the 60 year of elementary school. Then it is resumed in a summary form in the first year of high school and in Denmark.
Yes, this is also a fairly tricky question because our curriculum is not set like that. It's more that there are, we could call them larger issues that they must study. Of course, they have to study different time periods. But for instance, it doesn't say anywhere that I have to cover the Roman Empire or that I have to cover the Second World War. For instance, it says you must cover the battle of the ideologies in the 20th century, but you could do that by studying the Spanish Civil War or decolonization. So there's really a lot that is up to the individual teachers. So it doesn't say specifically how much time I have to spend on everything. I can more or less do what I want. It's just that as a medievalist, I spend a lot of time teaching the Crusades, whereas other teachers might skip a bit of that or focus more on the Vikings or something along those lines. So this is simply just that this is my interest and my specialty, and that of course makes it a lot easier for me to come up with alternative sources to present to my students and use that as a jumping off point to teach them something about critical analysis and applying historical methods. I know it's fairly weird to, I think, most other countries that
are more autonomy for
so much autonomy. I mean, there used to be 17 points that we had to cover, but right now it is a lot more open to interpretation. And I think one of the few very specific points we have is that we must have at least one theme that is the world outside Europe and the United States. So we also see some more global awareness and possibly undermining the Eurocentric, to go back to what you said, Michael, is an element of it.
So, Luis, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. First, a quick question to Brian, which is, you've mentioned you use a Kim Kardashian selfie to talk about Renaissance. I want to know more about that. The other question is for the three of you, because you all talked in some capacity, I think, to the interest students have in the Middle Ages. So my question is, how do you see perhaps this recent spike in medieval interest in media, as these things seem to happen ever so often? How is that changing this perception over the Middle Ages? Of course, your years of teaching. And a bonus part of the question is, with the pandemic and the isolation and the whole death and Black Death comparison, have you seen any changes in the view the students bring to class about the Middle Ages? Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, the Kim Kardashian element was actually for an old kind of the A-level exam where the students received 10 to 15 pages of material and then had 24 hours to prepare a presentation and had to ask questions on their own. And I was really, really tired one evening when I made my Renaissance set. I'm just going to screen share with you, and then I think it's going to make some more sense, because some of the sources compared the Renaissance to the postmodern era, and then something just snapped, and I decided to put this into my exam material. Of course, to ask the students how similar is the Renaissance to what we see today. Almost like the lighting is fairly similar in this one. And then I think I've talked enough for now, so leave the two of you to get started on the question there.
Well, I found that I try to cash in on the interest in the Middle Ages and the media by making analogies. I say things like, has anyone watched Game of Thrones? And if anyone nods, I say, well, this is where he got the idea for, oh, it's so long since I've watched the show, I've forgotten the names of the characters, but where the guy sacrifices his daughter to change the weather, that's a reference to Euripides, was it? Aeschylus. I can't remember. One of the Greek tragedians, or I say the Dothraki, they're like the Huns or the Mongols. Unfortunately, my students don't seem to watch Game of Thrones. So I have to update my analogies. The Black Death one, that I got more of headway with from my students. In my Making Connections assignment last semester, lots of people in my early Western civilization class did the connection between the Black Death and the pandemic. And I think the pandemic has helped remove that distancing of the Middle Ages. I always try to break down this ignorant medieval people, didn't know about infectious disease, how foolish. And I always say to them, no one understood infectious disease till the 19th century. And I think, but the experience, I think, has really made people understand it's not unique to the Middle Ages, that people don't deal well or are ignorant. We do have the medical knowledge, and still people won't wear masks or think that microchips are being implanted by Jeff Bezos when they have a vaccine. And it's really helped to break down that medieval ignorance versus modern wisdom and understanding, another of these false dichotomies we have to push against.
Thank you. Carol, would you like to make another question? I mean, I think you're a panelist now. You can unmute yourself. Carol? Okay, so.
She actually couldn't, now she can.
Oh. As we fixed the problem with Carol, Claudia with another one. Okay.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Okay, you're back. So
yeah, for some reason it reconnected me.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. Me once again. My question is for Professor Michael. You mentioned that using figures like Mansa Musa and Cheng He has the problem of making it look like they are exceptions. But you also said that you believe there's a measure of medievalism there. Can you explain that a little bit more? Can you give a clearer idea as to why it is a form of medievalism to focus on these specific individual characters?
I think when I come up with that idea, I was thinking more about Mansa Musa than Zheng He. Mansa Musa, he is usually represented in the textbooks from an image from the Catalan Atlas, where, so it's a Eurocentric perspective again. It's a Portolan map, and it has, in Mali, it has a representation of Mansa Musa holding up a gold scepter, and it is literally gilded. It is literally gold. And there's a lot of sort of exoticism about it. It's always presented from this European perspective. I've no idea if there are African images of Mansa Musa. I don't know. They may simply be using the only available image there is. But it's refracted through this lens of a medieval European perspective, and also the exoticizing of him as this fabulously wealthy figure, I think plays into the image we have of the Middle Ages as being an age of, when we think of medieval wealth, it's thought of in terms of plunder. Think of Viking coin hoards, maybe, in the earlier Middle Ages. And it's also rather Orientalist, I think, the fabulous, wealthy, in this case, Africa, but usually the fabulous wealthy East, it is sort of the flip side of the Orientalism of the backwardness of Africa. So I think maybe I'm overselling it a little by calling it medievalism, but it's certainly refracted through a lot of these lenses like Orientalism and Eurocentrism that, and I think medievalism is part of those, is one of those lenses that distract us from getting a more rounded view of that society.
Perfect, that's super clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Claudia, you can go on. You're muted.
Sorry, my question is for Professor Michael. I was very impressed with your presentation, Professor, because the global Middle Ages is a way of denaturalize the Middle Ages. My question is, how do you categorize periodization for connections with the space that deny the Middle Ages a colonialist periodization, such as Asian or Africa?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a big debate about how we define the global Middle Ages. The term the global Middle Ages is often used. It's problematic for the reasons you've specified. Middle Ages is almost by definition a Eurocentric term. And as others, both of you have said, it's also an artificial and misleading term. In the middle of what? It's an invention of the Renaissance to denigrate the Middle Ages as this era of decline between the classical and the Renaissance periods. Other societies don't go through that pattern. Even if we accept that crude pattern of decline and rebirth, the Islamic world does not go through that pattern. The Islamic golden age is Europe's early Middle Ages. Europe's, quotes, dark age is the Islamic golden age. It is very difficult to come up with a concept. Post-classical has been suggested because the classical civilizations of Europe are paralleled in the China of Confucius and Lao-Tzu, the India of the Buddha, and so you have these great philosophers in all those cultures at around the same time, the Iran of Zoroaster. But again, that's problematic because classical, again, is a judgment, it's a value judgment. And again, the classical age of the Dar al-Islam is our Middle Ages, is the West's Middle Ages. So it is very difficult to come up with a term to satisfactorily describe that period. When I, in my world history class, titled a class Medieval China, one of my students very perceptively said, I've never heard this expression before. Where are you getting this idea of medieval China from? And I had to explain to him, well, you know, I call that period medieval. I'm just transferring a Eurocentric term to a non-European culture.
Perfect, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Brian, you have a question?
Yes, this is for both of my fellow panelists. I wonder whether you ever received some sort of pushback from some of your students and how you handled it. For instance, Claudia, you've talked about, and I don't know enough about Brazil to really comment on this, but you talk about the Pentecostal revival, and Michael, you talk about undermining the Eurocentric, and well, some of my students have some pushback against this. At one point, one of my students got fairly angry when we talked about the US and went all, white people built that country. And I thought, oh, okay. So do you ever receive something, students whose image of the world is completely rocked, and how do you handle that?
I've not experienced much pushback in medieval history. I get, when students write reflection pieces, I get a lot of people sympathizing with the downtrodden and the excluded. And I wonder to what extent that they're performing what they think I want them to say. I like to joke with my US history class that everybody is for feminism and anti-racism so long as it's 150 years in the past. It's very generic comments in discussions from students saying things like, it's terrible how badly slaves were treated, and it's terrible that women couldn't have the vote. And I think I'd like to know a little bit more, well, I'd like something a little more perceptive than that. I'd also like to know a little more what you really think. So I don't get much pushback, but I wonder if they are just going through the motions of saying what I think they want me to hear. The only pushback I recall is more from the US, modern US history. When I was talking about the War of 1898, and which of course is relevant to Latin American history because it leads to the seizure of Puerto Rico by the United States and the effective seizure of Cuba, supposedly independent, effectively a US dependency. And I kept talking about imperialism and heard some muttering by two students on the back rows complaining about me saying imperialism. And I had to say, this is a term people at the time used. Mark Twain, when he's protesting it, is protesting American imperialism. This is not me projecting backwards. This is a term that they use. And I think in any period, I do like to refocus and say, this is what they were saying at the time. This is not just me saying this, to try to encourage them to think through the eyes of that time period.
Luis?
Okay, it's me.
Sorry.
Sorry, Brian. The resistance of my students comes mainly in the question of the debate on Christian history, because Brazil is a large country, Christian country. But I always start from the perspective of questioning and use many sources to demonstrate that there are different perspectives on what it was like to be a Christian in a pre-modern world and how this is different from today. This is my way.
Thank you both. Very, very inspirational for that. And it's fascinating when we sort of see the students opening their eyes. And just for everybody watching, I don't only look at right-wing appropriation of something. One of my normal successes is that I have the students read a series of Danish newspaper articles only mentioning the positive elements about the Ottoman Empire, and the students notice only positive elements are mentioned. And then I ask them, so what is the newspaper? Look up the political stance of this newspaper, and they figure out it's a left-wing newspaper. Okay, when was this published? Late 2001. Okay, students, why do you think that a left-wing newspaper decided to say positive things about a Muslim country at the end of 2001? And then they figure it out and say, oh, Brian, it's all connected. Well, yes, that's why we're doing this. So it is quite interesting pulling on those threads right there.
Sorry again, Claudia, interrupted you. Sorry. Luis?
I would just like to follow on Brian's question and ask to Mike and also to Claudia to talk a bit about this, because here in Brazil we had not that long ago an attempt to remove medieval history and ancient history from our basic curriculum, and this is something that is often still debated amongst historians. So my question to Michael is there any similar debate there in the US, like the idea that medieval past this is not our past, let's take just USian history? And also to Claudia, I think it will be interesting for you to talk a bit about this to our panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the Middle Ages is often absent from the teaching of history at higher institutions, at four-year universities. Very often, if you see jobs advertised, they are for medieval and early modern, and sometimes medieval and early modern and classical. And the job will also say, candidates I prefer to can teach Latin American history or African history, and partly that's the nature of the job market, the absurd lengths to which people are expected to have expertise in the job market. I've not encountered much explicit don't teach this because it's not American history. Sometimes there's this strange intersection between the politicians and the people who draw up the budget and want to save money, wanting to cut medieval history, and the calls for decolonization or diversification. And obviously it's a good thing that there's more jobs in Latin American history, African history, Asian history. Clearly that is unadulteratedly a good thing. But within the constraints of a market-driven university system, where there are limited resources, this can often come at the expense of the Middle Ages and the classics, which are seen not necessarily explicitly as too Eurocentric, but perhaps seen as too old-fashioned, too boring, perhaps, even though students love the Middle Ages and love the ancient world from their pop culture interaction with it. And there's an interesting example in the United Kingdom when University of Leicester is currently firing its medievalists. And they framed it, they walked this back later, but they initially framed it as we're decolonizing the curriculum. They were quite cynically using progressive language about diversification to make job cuts and to save money. And unfortunately, some of the American left, the American medievalists left, unfortunately, bought into this idea. And they said, we're not signing a petition to save jobs at Leicester because you people are all a bunch of white supremacist, racists. So there's this strange interaction of cynical, conservative money saving and diversification, which can be cynically seized upon by the people making the cuts.
I don't know, Luis, if I will be able to defend all the elements that this answer needs in my basic English, but I'm sorry, but I talk in Portuguese, okay? Primeiro, nós vivemos talvez o momento na história do Brasil em que a Idade Média é mais mobilizada publicamente num uso político que, retomando de memória estudos, por exemplo, do período Vargas, da nossa história da ditadura militar, nós não enfrentamos uma valorização, né, uma mistificação de uma periodização histórica em cima de uma figuração estética, de virilidade, de branquitude, como isso tem sido mobilizado nos últimos anos aqui. Então, a Idade Média, mais do que nunca, sobretudo por causa do medievalismo, ela precisa estar presente nos currículos da educação básica, como uma forma não só de apresentar um mundo que não existe mais, mas também demonstrar o quanto esse mundo é diverso dessas perspectivas que estão correntes aí no debate público a respeito dos usos, né, da Idade Média. Você, melhor do que eu, sabe os impactos disso num ambiente social em que as pessoas querem se livrar, né, umas das outras, querem exterminar grupos que pensam de forma contrária. E a Idade Média tem servido a esses grupos como uma leitura histórica completamente equivocada, já começa por aí, mas também como uma arma em torno de um fascínio com relação a uma ideia de um tempo muito, 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 muito recuado, que nos coloca numa posição de embate efetivo e defesa de um ensino mais qualificado dessas temporalidades muito recuadas na educação básica. Então, não dá para tirar a Idade Média da educação básica, porque ela é apropriada contemporaneamente como uma bandeira política, sobretudo, de grupos que querem exterminar outros grupos dentro do nosso espaço territorial que não teve uma Idade Média. Então, é preciso falar sobre isso mais do que nunca. E acho que a maneira de falar isso bem na educação básica é justamente apresentando um mundo que não existe mais. Por mais que a gente tenha ganas em história de buscar a origem das coisas, o nosso mundo tem uma outra organização, coerência, estrutura, que não é mais aqueles mundos, né, dessa periodização clássica que se localiza aí entre século V e século XV, tá?
Luis, would you like to translate? I myself may translate it.
Up to you. I have noted everything she said in case.
Okay, so Claudia, please correct me if I missed something. Broadly speaking, what you said is that the main problem here is a political one, because we've been going through like very radical political changes in the last decades, and these political changes were not met with conceptual debates about racial, misogynistic, authoritarian conceptions, all these conceptions that some right-wing groups use to their favor to support their political corollary or something like this. So precisely because of that, we need medieval history in the curriculum to show our students that Middle Ages are not associated, I mean, they can be associated in some kind of political use or abuse in modern contemporary thought, but I mean, Middle Ages by themselves, may I use it? Okay, Middle Ages by themselves were more plural, diverse, heterogeneous, or something like this, than these groups advocate. So putting Middle Ages in the curriculum is more something like an instrument to confront this kind of political discourse. Is that right, Claudia? Anything else you would like for me to add?
Perfect.
Thank you. So Brian, I think. No. So if I may, Claudia, since you've touched this point, how do you interpret this kind of necessity with public history? Because I know you're very interested in public history. I forgot to mention that earlier, sorry. How can we articulate this kind of movement within schools with public history more broadly in terms of Middle Ages, and how can we tackle this kind of discourse?
For me, the public history is a base of the students' part to thinking about the Middle Ages. It's necessary establish a dialogue with the public history, because public history is multiple forms that explain use and abuse of history, but the public history had a sense of orientation in historic process. And I think that is so necessary, connected the public history, because it's the first contact with the elementary students and the high school students with the Middle Ages in Brazil today, okay?
Thank you. Carol said it, we're gonna discuss this. I mean, we know, I mean, herself, Dani Galindo, and there's another table tomorrow. I forgot the third one. Carol, who was the third one?
Paul Sturtevant.
Who?
Paul Sturtevant from the public.
Okay. So tomorrow we'll have more more material to work with on this point. Questions? We still have time.
Hobson, there is a question in the Q&A part by Nicholas. Can you see it?
No. Oh, Q&A. Okay. Okay. Nicholas Rabelo asked, in the 1930s, the figure of the indigenous was used by the Brazilian integralist action as an equivalent to the medieval hero. How far can right-wing extremist political movements adapt their rhetoric tactics by molding the notion of ideal past? The question is addressed to everyone.
Well, I can just jump in and say, well, that is after all something we see all the time. I think it's interesting to see the movement right there with having the indigenous. I don't know if that's connected to some sort of noble savage idea or something that was original, but it does sound like, if I have to put it into a Danish context, a fascination with the Vikings, for instance, as true men before Christianity showed up and made everything a bit weaker. So I think that there's an element of that nostalgia. Once upon a time, things were better, that we really see a lot of today, because, well, the world is moving rather quickly with decolonization and more awareness of gender issues, and then it's very easy to long for an imagined past that never really existed. And I think, well, that's something you can see from every political angle, but like I can see is said in the comments with the Q shaman from earlier today, that is something that really happens on the right right now, because they're desperately trying to cling on to a waning world where they were in power.
I think it's quite interesting where you get these contested medievalisms. There are so many examples of medievalism used by the far right. An example I was going to use, but I cut because I realized that my material on trade networks versus exploration was a thing in itself. I was going to address this, but and one element I was going to use was the English Defence League in England use medieval imagery. It's very pseudo-medieval. It's the Crusader Knight with the Red Cross, which is something which arguably didn't even exist. So it's this pseudo-medieval imagery. But and some things are very obviously used by the right because they are patriarchal and violent and colonialist, like the Crusades. Not that it was any of those things necessarily in reality, or not that it was all of those things in reality, but that's how it's perceived. But I find it far more interesting to think about the contested spaces. Thinking about the Vikings, coming back to Brian's point, is the Thor's hammer symbol, which there was a controversy at the Leeds Medieval Conference a few years ago around the sale of Thor's hammer memorabilia at a stall at the conference. And one medievalist of color was saying this is racist. And I think that's a little bit of an overstatement. It's more a contested symbol. Neo-paganism can tie into a green, feminist, egalitarian interpretation. It's still an idealized past, but it's an idealized past cast in a, wouldn't it be great to go back to before patriarchal feudal society? And it can be cast in a white supremacist, vigorous Nordic people, hairy men, you know, big, strong men doing manly things. And symbols like that can be contested. And I find it problematic, even if it's not done in a right-wing sense. I'm a little suspicious of anybody who says, I want to idealize people from Northern Europe, given the Nazi appropriation of that. But I accept that it doesn't make you a white supremacist to be interested in that past, and these things can be contested between left and right, and are not necessarily things that can or should be conceded to the right. And at the risk of sounding very positivist and simplistic and not very postmodern, the real history, if there's even such a thing, can be a way of engaging in that debate and engaging in that contest over who claims these symbols.
Well, Nicholas, it is necessary to deal with these different appropriations about medieval history, but for that we will need to be more autonomous in the application of the curriculum and the work with the appropriation of the Middle Ages through the history of Brazil, because a time to work in curriculum, in Brazilian curriculum, is so short. We need put the appropriation of the Middle Ages in history of Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else would like to make some comments on this?
I could see the question from Lucas.
Yes.
In the chat.
Mm-hmm. I think I can read it for you, because I think it's directed for all of you three. Okay, so it's a commentary / question, so I'm gonna read it. Lucas said, I advocate for history theory as means to escape this question of why to study the Middle Ages. It seems clear to me that anyone questioning the validity of medieval history didn't get the theory right and cannot advance on why do we study history at all. So my question is from a theoretical perspective: how to accommodate history theory and medievalism in the classroom?
Yeah, I can jump straight into that and bring in some of the quotes from some of my students that I had during our chat. And remember, these are from students 18 to 19 years old. Especially we talked about whether it's a good idea to include memes and online content in our lessons. And of course, they thought it was a brilliant idea for various reasons. But when I asked them, can we teach you how to navigate the online universe? First of all, it's interesting that Anine answered that she spends 2 hours a day watching TikTok videos. And they actually follow certain historical videos on TikTok, some of them really silly with fish swimming around the Titanic. But some of them also quite serious. And Heckler in particular said that it's a good idea to bring up different movements and spread awareness of them. For instance, most of my students hadn't heard about, well, QAnon or the incels or something like that before I brought it up, although they had seen memes and phrasings that were adjacent to them online. And then Heckler went on to say, we have to learn how to keep an eye out. And when you get used to looking at the sender and what the bias of the sender is in every lesson, then it's something that you actually keep doing in your spare time. And Mads made his teacher really, really happy when he said that the other day he stumbled upon a meme about the Ottoman Empire, and he immediately thought, wait, that's not true, because he, once again, to tie into Michael's positivist approach, because he knew the facts from everything. So simply by including and saying this is out there, come on, let's always look at the context, let's always look at who the sender is. Well, it's really, really efficient training in the classroom.
Well, Lucas, it is a wonderful and difficult question at the same time. I think that working with historiographic operation as an ethically responsible narrative form can be one of the ways. Teach how to make history. This will require working with medievalism and documents.
Professor Michael, would you like to make any comments on that?
I was hoping I could avoid that one. It's such a good question, such a big question about theory. In my Western civilization classes, I try to run them in parallel between the big superficial textbook, which is the one I showed you the contents of, Western civilization in one book. I try to run that in parallel with a little book, which I don't think I have to hand now, called History, A Very Short Introduction, from the Oxford University Press Short Introduction series, which talks about these issues of approaches and how and why we do history. And fortunately for me as a medievalist, the author of that book, John Arnold, is a medievalist. And he begins with an example from the Inquisition records in southern France in the 14th century, where he takes a document and says, this is a story about a murder, but it's also a story about religion, because the only reason we know about the murder is it is recorded not as a criminal case about the murder, but as part of the Inquisition, because these brothers murdered somebody because they thought he was an informer for the Inquisition. And he goes on to say, but it also tells us about how they told time. They don't say this happened on January the 30th. They say this happened on Saint whoever's, I don't know my saint's days, on the saint's day of so-and-so. It also tells us about geography. There's references to what crops being grown in the fields and crossing over a bridge. You get a sense of the geography, the economy of the land. And I find that book a very useful introduction. I struggle a little with my students to get them beyond simplistic, this is biased. And I like to say, so what's your point? It's bias. So I'm biased, you're biased. What's your point? And I try to get them to think, well, it's biased because, and then I say, is it a bad source? No, I suppose it tells us things. What does it tell us? Well, it tells us this happened on this day, even if their interpretation may be biased. And then I ask them things like, well, does the bias itself tell us something? And some of the students who are understanding what I'm getting at, who are understanding that I'm making the point, bias itself is informative. They say things like, yeah, it does tell us, it tells us that society is very patriarchal because of the way in which women are described in the document. So on a good day, sometimes we do get to those more critical thinking skills, but sometimes I don't get much beyond in students' papers, this document is biased. But I try. I try to get them to think creatively about the nature of sources. And the Middle Ages is a good period for sources because we have this wonderful range of sources from chronicles down to manorial records of who is paying a fine for hitting their neighbor over the head and so on. So it is a source-rich period.
Thank you, Michael. There's another question from Haoni. I think that's how I spell it. He asked, how does religious dogmatism or non-discussed limitations, he used it on, I don't know how to say that in English, like, I think you got it. Okay, language sign is awesome on these situations. How does religious dogmatism or non-discussed limitations on historical approaches reaching academic level about events such as the Albigensis Crusade, San Bartolomeo's Massacre, the persecution killing of non-Orthodox or non-Trinitary Christians, could undermine our understanding and thus the act of teaching about religious intolerance in the Middle Ages? Who would like to begin? So,
I guess I'm going to go first because I already mentioned Cathars and Inquisition. That's a really great question to which I don't have a simple answer. I think in some ways it ties into what we began by talking about, where Brian talks about they think the Middle Ages is all backwardness and violence and religious intolerance. And one part of that is the religious intolerance aspect, and to try and get beyond a simplistic, everybody was being burnt at the stake all the time kind of approach. I like, and this again was where medievalism is handy to cut across those temporal periodic barriers, is to say, well, do you think that genocide is typical of the modern era? And I say, well, no, we're not always killing each other. Well, Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, it was happening all the time, surely. Surely isn't a typical day in the life of a 20th century person to be killed or starved or put in a concentration camp because you're the wrong religion or ethnic group or political persuasion and so on. And again, at that point, I begin to get some sort of, they give me some sense, oh, I know what he's getting at, to try and get beyond that exceptionalism of the Middle Ages, and to get them to understand that there are similar things go on in other eras. They may be done in the names of different ideas, it may be done in the name of nationalism or ideology rather than religion, but we can draw these parallels and try to break down that exceptionalism approach to the Middle Ages.
Claudia, Brian, comments?
I agree with Brian and Michael Evans, because my basic English not supports a largest plan about this, but it's a hard question because touch in identical reference is I'm not prepared for this.
And I'm really happy I can be the last one to answer this, because it gave me some time to think about such a complicated question. And I remembered when I teach a course on cultural encounters and cultural clashes, in combination with the subjects social studies and religion, which is a really great combination for this. I sometimes cover what we call how you portray the enemy, to show that there's something very basically human about it. For instance, sometimes for exam material I use, the illustration of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, almost at a tournament, and Saladin's face is blue and sort of deformed, and he wears the same hat as his horse. It's fairly odd, and we say he's portrayed as being really monstrous in this manuscript from the 13th century. And then we look at propaganda from the First and Second World War. We look at modern day propaganda. We can see that nothing has really changed in terms of intolerance, even across cultures. That dehumanizing the enemy was something they did in the Middle Ages, and we certainly still do it today. So nothing has changed. There's something very basically human, and no matter if you look at Japanese propaganda from the Second World War, or anti-German British propaganda from the First World War, or something from the Crusades, or even the exam text from 1001 Nights, with the claim that the Christians use excrements in sacred rituals. That this is portrayal of the enemy that is if not ubiquitous, then it spans time and place, and tells us something about what it means to be human. And sometimes what it means to be human is to be intolerant and force yourself to dehumanize the other in order to be able to kill them. And that's usually quite an eye-opener, that humanity hasn't changed that much over the past couple of thousand years. A lot of our thought patterns are the same.
Thank you. Any more questions? I mean, we're almost on time. Luis, can you confirm that to me?
Yes, we are, but if anyone has, we could go for one last final question.
Okay.
Or maybe not.
Maybe not. Okay. So I think we had a great time on this last 2 hours with great discussions, great topics, and I'd like to thank everyone, the panelists, the audience, and I think we're done for the day, but tomorrow we have another busy one. So we'll see you tomorrow. So again, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.